My name is Mark, and this is the Path of Zen podcast. All right, so we are going to be talking about what is Zen. So a little bit about myself. My name is Mark V. Tannen. I'm a Zen student since about 1985. Have been studying all aspects of Zen Buddhism, from the history to where it came from, to where the teachings came from, to current thoughts, old thoughts. So I have quite a vast range of Zen, but I also should warn you that I have a very different view of Zen that you might find from the Zen centers. So the things I will say may challenge you. It may make you curious or angry. And if you are a current Zen student, a lot of the things I'm going to say probably are going to puzzle you because they're going to be either contradictory or a little bit different than what the Zen centers say. And I will tell you why. When I say them, they are different or contradictory. And for those of you who are new to Zen or have no idea what this is, I will be explaining things out in detail, hopefully to really break them down to their meanings, because words have meanings, and break them down into a way that can be understood and give you some things to think about. So the first thing I think we should even talk about is what exactly is Zen? All right, we should know that Zen is a Japanese word that more or less means the nature of mind. Some people want to translate that as mind or to mind, but when you really start looking at the word Zen, as in how it's looked at from the Chinese call it Chan, and that came from the southern Asian areas, which they call it Dhyanam. And that really, Dhyana means, by the way, to see and to hold. Chan means more like nature, mind, or mind of nature. So Zen, when you really look at the word, is about, it's kind of a pointing to the nature of mind. What is the nature of your entire mind? And so we'll be discussing what mind is, and we'll be discussing what that nature is in these podcasts to come. So when we look at Zen as a word, we start to understand that it becomes a process of discovery and learning and exploration. It's not a religion, as in let's go and pray to a god or something like that. It's a process of discovery and learning that we are engaging in. So when somebody says, I am a Zen student, this is somebody who is implying that they are delving into the nature of mind. And we are assuming that it's their mind that they're delving into and the nature of it. And then we can also assume that because we all have the similar human bodies and live in the same world, and we all have the same experiences, that we are talking about the human mind and then mind in general, because we don't know of any other mind. We don't know of the mind of animals or the mind of gods or anything like that. So the nature of mind is the exploration of Zen. So we also know that Zen is, I would say it's a methodology, and that's a very controversial word because a lot of people try to say that Zen means nothing or Zen means everything, and these are usually from people that don't understand what Zen is, or from people who really never put much thought into it and they're just throwing an offhanded remark about it. So we know that Zen has come to us through a long process from, I would say, probably from the Indo-Indian region. So, most people say, well, where did Buddhism start at? And a lot of people try to say it's India, and it didn't start in India. It probably more or less originated in the Iran-Syrian area, and then migrated into India and then into the Far East. So where did the actual Zen process started? Probably somewhere in probably a fusion when the Greeks were migrating into the Syrian India area and into the northern part of India. The Shakya clan was called the Aryans, which they would also be known as Proto-Europeans. They were a fair-skinned, which means not black, and they were not seen as native to the parts of that world. They were outsiders. They also called them the snake people because they wore pants. We also know that at that point in time that the world was ruled by royalties and wealthy merchant families. It's pretty much how the ancient world worked. You were either involved in the royalty, or you were born into it, or you were the heirs of a wealthy merchant family. And pretty much everybody else under you was in some sort of serfdom or slave class. That's pretty much the entire way the ancient world worked back then. Education in the ancient world, if you were fortunate to be born in the royalty or a wealthy merchant family, you would have teachers. And a lot of these teachers were coming from the sophist class. And this was educated people, generally educated in math and philosophy and reading and writing, and it was would be considered a classical education. So the sophists were paid, more or less, by the royal families and the merchants to teach their children, and they lived within the palaces or the houses of these people, and they were tutors. There was no such thing as public schools back then. So the only other ways of learning, if you were not fortunate to have a tutor, would be going to the temples. And the temples, you would either your families would pay for you to become a monk or enter the monastic system of these temples, where you could learn to read and write. And in the ancient world, even going clear up to even the 1800s, people who could read and write were always promoted into higher positions in society. For an example, even in the Roman Empire, in the ancient days, those men that could even read were always made officers within the military, because they could receive orders and then follow them via paper. It was an efficient means. So reading and writing in the ancient world was really your step up to a much more productive and reading and writing in the ancient world would give you a station and position that would otherwise be unattainable. So when you get a good picture of how the ancient world worked, which is quite different than today, you start to understand that the way that Zen, or what we know as Zen today, was more or less brought into the Southern Asian areas, and eventually into the Far East. I would say mostly by wealthy families, royalty, various other, and also through the temple systems, though. So you also have to understand that in the southern part of Asia, monasticism existed prior to Buddhism and prior to Zen. Monasticism is it more, we think of this as, a religious convent, as some sort of place where people want to congregate and live a very religious life. And in the East, prior to the arrival of Zen and Buddhism, you would have temples would be built, and then the monasticism monasticism in the East, more or less, it was developed to provide rudimentary education to novice shamans and priests, but also to service the more wealthy families and the royalty, and provide a way for somewhat of a religious life, or a religious, I hate to say, control of the people, because it has always been in the case where the wealthy and the royalty kind of used the religion to control the people by expressing what messages and what morality that they wanted the people to live by. And so that's pretty much how monasticism was working in ancient world. I mean, you would have the royalty that would say, these are my laws and this is my will, but then you would have the priests that would more or less serve as an apologetic class for the royalty, and use the position of religion to apologize for the royal edicts and get the people to go along with them. So we know that Zen is, just by the history of Zen and by the history of the word, which means nature of mind, we know now, we can pretty much know that Zen is not a cultural religion. It's not of a people or a place. It's, you talk about a cultural religion, and that would kind of be like Native American shamanism, because that's definitely a people and a place. Japanese Shinto, that's people and a place. Hinduism is of the Hindu people and the place. It's not something that can be easily transported to a different place or a different people. So this is something that one has to recognize about when we talk about what Zen is. And so we know it's not a cultural religion or of a people or of a place. And so when we look further at Zen, because we're talking the nature of mind, we start to realize that it's also not a worship of it's not theism. It's not a worship of a supreme being. It's not being saved by anybody. So, a lot of people, when they think of Zen, they think of the big Buddha statues that are in the temples, or the big Buddha statues that they see, in Japan, and they think, oh, well, you worship Buddha, you worship this guy sitting there with his hand in the air or something like that, and that is not true at all. I would say that the Buddha statues more or less represent the awakened mind, and we'll get more into the awakened mind later or in different podcasts. So when the Buddha statues actually did not exist until, I don't know, much later in the development of what we call Buddhism. It actually that's a name that was given to the kind of belief system the Brits saw when they came into the southern Asian countries to colonize them in the 1600s. It was actually called Brahmayana, and in a lot of ways, it didn't really have a whole lot of, there wasn't really much of a name to it. But when the Brits, found the yellow-robed wearing monks, the Theravadins, they started calling it Buddhism, because they were saying, well, you're studying the teachings of this Buddha, the teachings of the awakened one, or I would say the teachings of awakening. So probably, I would say, prior to the British coming in and giving this name Buddhism to what they found, there were already Buddha statues being made. I think going clear back to the, 11th, 12th century is when those things started to really start being popularized. So the Buddha statues really represent the enlightened mind or the enlightened person, not necessarily a person. It's not a Jesus, it's not a Muhammad. It's representation of a universal mind, the awakened one. And that could be anything, anybody. Prior to the statues, usually the enlightened mind would be represented by an empty chair, sometimes by a bowl that was not filled with anything. Sometimes it was just a flat surface like a table, and other times just a tree or nothing. So the idea that that we pray to a Buddha is a misnotion. And I should also say, just for the sake of it, that for one, I have studied the Buddhist canon, and it is actually a heresy to call an inanimate object, a non-sentient thing, a Buddha. So with that in mind, you start to realize that the Buddha statues, the paintings of the Buddha, these images that are now all common when one thinks of Zen and Buddhism, are more aspirational images. They're more representations of the awakened mind rather than of any particular person in history. People would say, "Oh, so do you worship and pray to that there Buddha?" And you have to just chuckle and say, "Well, no," because you know that the person that's saying that statement doesn't even understand what the Buddha means. And we also know that most people just sort of know Buddhism through TV or pop movies, and that kind of Buddhism is highly misleading and highly inaccurate. So we're talking about the Buddha statues being a representation of the awakened mind, and Zen, the Zen methodology that becomes apparent when you're starting to look at a Zen. You want to ask, well, what is this methodology? And the Zen methodology. So, like I said, Zen, even though Zen means the awakening of mind, but it also means the process of awakening mind, because I said Zen is to the awakened mind, or kind of like the arrow pointing to the awakened mind. So it implies a process, a methodology. So when we look at the Zen methodology that has come to us, and here in the West, that methodology has come from Japan. So when we start to actually look at, we go through, we look through, and we brush aside all of the cultural and sort of this religious etiquette that has come to us from the Japanese temples, and we push that aside, and we look at what is the hardcore nuts and bolts of the methodology. And we find that it uses discourses. This is and they call these Dharma talks in the Zen centers, though there really are just lectures from the teachers or the educated ones at the Zen centers. And they're pointing to the nature. What is the nature of mind? What is the nature of the soul? What is the nature of phenomena? And so they're trying to teach you a metaphysics, a metaphysical language. And this is done through discourses. This could be public discourses. These can be private interviews. But these are lectures. And sometimes they put them in written form, and you would read books on these educated lectures about the metaphysics. Because in order to talk about the nature of the spiritual nature of things, you have to have a language, and that language is learned so that you can have a discussion about them. and you can understand them, and you can explore them, and you can kind of push yourself deeper into an understanding or a seeing. So the discussion and the what they call Dharma talks or just Zen talks is the first part of the method. You have to know what it is that we're talking about, and you have to be educated. The second part of the method is the more or less what I call the Socratic discussions, and these can either be one-on-one, face-to-face meetings with the teachers, or groups in a group with senior students or other students, where you would more or less kind of delve into in a Socratic methodology of why do you think something, why do you believe something, why do you think you know something. And this can go a long way to help dissolve doubts, conquer fears, brush aside held convictions or things that you think are so that are just not. So this can go a long ways into building faith, establishing a deeper conviction, but also people can, when going through the Socratic discussions, can learn a lot about themselves and a lot about the things that they think is so that are just not. So that the Socratic discussions can be of different types. Some groups will do them as, the small groups will do this together. Sometimes it's only done from face to face, from the student to the teacher. The Tibetans will do this like in big circles. You'll have big circles of monks doing this, and these discussions can either be very moderated and there's a format to them, or they can be kind of ad hoc, where anything goes. And in the Tibetan schools, they would have these sort of discussions which were kind of very ad hoc, anything goes. That can involve anything from shouting and screaming to hitting. You're not hitting somebody to hurt them, but you're just sort of hitting them to get their attention. And sometimes they will call you names. I have even seen some name calling in the Zen centers from time to time, but that's rare. So this is a big part of it, is the Socratic discussions. And so the last part of the Zen methodology is what I call the insight meditation. In Japanese call that Zazen. And it's where one will sit in serene meditation, which can also be called serene prayer, where one delves inward to discover the spiritual mysteries for themselves. And so all three of these, the discourses, the Socratic discussion, and the insight meditation, form the kernel of the Zen methodology. There could also be some other aspects to the methodology. Some people would say work projects, or various types of devotional or devotion. So when I talk about the devotional part of this, that would be like the ceremonies or the sort of the religious behavior that you would see if you were to go to a Zen center or a Zen temple. And this is very much a, where you're basically reaffirming or recommitting yourself at all times, in all ways, to the path to the awakened mind, where you are praising the awakened mind, you are aspiring to the awakened mind, you are wanting to be that awakened mind. However, that is not necessarily the only thing that you're praising, because there are other steps. Awakening in Zen is not the end goal, but rather the prerequisite to actually follow the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. because his particular teachings are of the liberation of the mind, and you first have to awaken to the nature of your suffering, the nature of your mind, before you can liberate it. So the Zen methodology puts you into that position to where the teachings of the Buddha actually work, actually take hold. So when we look at Zen, a lot of people say, oh, Zen is not about faith. Zen is not a belief, and that is not true at all. Zen is a path of faith, at least at the beginning, because you have to have faith that the path will work. And you have to have faith that the teachings are true, and you have to have faith that what the Buddha taught is true. And without any of this, the whole thing falls down. So, and then you have to have belief. You do have to believe that you're not being lied to. You have to believe that the people know what they are doing. And you have to believe that you can do this. Without any of those things, the whole thing again falls down. So this is something that a great majority of Western Zen students struggle with, is that of faith. I think they try to have faith in the whole thing. I know it's hard. A lot of people that come to Zen have had previous religious training in other disciplines like Christianity or Judaism, and things did not go well there for them. So they come to Zen with a lot of baggage. And this can be really a problem for years, if not decades, for them to get over that. Some don't. Some actually show up at the Zen centers with absolutely no religious background, and they dive right in, and boom, things go very, very well for them. All right, so we're looking at, again, to the Zen methodology. And I know this becomes very controversial, because people like to say, well, Zen is nothing. Zen is not a methodology. Zen can't be said. If you say anything about Zen, you're wrong. And that is I would say a mistaken notion to say that Zen is nothing. What you can say is that Zen is not one thing, or Zen is not an object, or Zen is not like just knowing something, like, oh, I know math, or oh, I know how to read and write. So that is not what it is. But Zen is a methodology to knowing. You're knowing your own mind, to awakening your mind. And so people say, well, then that's something to obtain. And I say, well, to awaken your mind is not necessarily something that you don't already have. It would be like waking up. You already have consciousness, but you're in an unconscious state. So you're not necessarily gaining anything you don't have. You're just wakening up to something that's already there. And so that's what kind of becomes what Zen is. Though it becomes very murky, because when people will say, well, I read this book from this old Zen master who said that if you say a word about Zen, then you don't know what Zen is. And I would point out that we're dealing with, in a context of those writings, when they were pointing out to where people were not very educated back then, and they were, a lot of them did not know how to read and write, and they had real concrete thinking. Oh, well, Zen is just sitting. Zen is just bowing at the Buddha altar. Oh, Zen is just putting out incense and doing offerings. Very concrete levels of thinking of what this was. And when they started to realize that Zen is not necessarily any of these things, but it's more of a process, an invisible. You can't see a process. You can't hold a process. You can't hold you can't say, oh, well, I'm going to paint a process. Just like the methodology of Zen, which is the process. You can't hold it. You can't paint it. You can't necessarily put it in chisel it in stone, so to speak. You can describe it. You can say, well, these are the things that we do. And you do see that all over the place in the writings of the old Zen masters. They are talking about the process, they're talking about the methodology, but they're also in the same breath, trying to say, well, you're not attaining, you're not coming here and going to like take out your mind and put a new mind in, or you're not going to become a different person. And so there was a lot of dispelling of wrong notions, and I would like to say concrete thinking from people that were not very bright, or whatever they call dullards, kind of didn't really get things that well. And so when you start to look at all of this, you start to see, this is what Zen is aiming for, that what we're trying to do here. And so there is definitely a path. You see the path. So then it's like, okay, so there's this path, and it uses discourses, Socratic discussion, insight, meditation, and that's the kernel of it. And this is going to help me awaken my own mind. It's the sleeper who is wanting to wake up. And so this is the path of Zen. A lot of people say, so what is waking up? And this waking up, in Japanese, they call it kensho. It's an awakening moment. So, it's like, I was, something happened. And generally when people wake up, there is changes to them. And those changes are often seen by other people, and they will comment, oh, you've changed. There's something about you that is different than when we first met you. And that is the kensho, the awakening. And for some people, it happens extremely fast. I think in my own experience, it was only a matter of weeks. For some other people, it could be, some people even come to the Zen Center already awakened. They were awakened long before they even knew what Zen was. Now they just want to kind of take it further, to find out what all about they want to gain a metaphysical language so that they can express themselves and, gain more courage and understanding to go further. Because enlightenment, like I said, is not the end goal, but the prerequisite of the much greater path of Buddhism. So here in Zen, I like to say that we hold, that Zen is the most expedient means of achieving enlightenment. But the enlightenment is not the end goal. The prerequisite to the greater path as taught by Siddhartha Gautama, and that path is usually soul purification and then liberation, which I know a lot of, again, that is controversial, because people like to say, Zen did not teach that the soul existed, which is not true. And it is yet another misconception that that Buddhism, there's no soul. And we will talk about that in another podcast about whether there's a soul or not, and what was the position of the Buddha on this. So enlightenment sort of, they call it the E word in the Zen centers. It's kind of a 4-letter word to some people, because a lot of people who have not waken up the enlightenment, they tend to fantasize of what this is. What is enlightenment? Is it Superman powers? Is it disappearing from this world? Is it being transported to some other world? Is it being a different person? Is it knowing all things at all times, like omnipotent? And, well, it's none of these things, obviously. Simply, enlightenment, at least within the Buddhist context, is knowing of your mind in this phenomenal world. In other words, you know what the nature of it is. You see it. It's not that you have an intellectual nature of it. It's that you see it. You have a true grasp of it. And that's the enlightenment. That's the aha. And you know why you suffer. You see it. You see why you suffer. And when that happens, everything changes. It can be what they call a turning point, where your life was going in one direction. You waken up to the nature of your own mind, and then you sort of like take a different direction of your life and everything. And it's a profound change. And some people, that change is instantly profound. And in other people, the change is slow. It just depends on their current life situation. So, but it is generally recognized that, like I said, other people will kind of tell you, hey, I'm kind of seeing some different things about you than when we first showed up. That's kind of a big sign. And some people will just kind of flat out will come out and tell you, hey, man, you know what? You've hit it. You've reached it. And it's not something to, well, great, Lord, give me my enlightenment badge and my enlightenment certificate, and I'll move on. That's not how that works. So, you just, when you're in these deep religious paths, because the awakening of the mind is a religious issue, because you're dealing with that of the spirit, you're dealing with that of the soul, and that of the material existence. And when you're dealing with those things, you're always dealing with enlightenment and always dealing with religion, always. So, again, when we're talking about enlightenment, the Buddha in the sutras, the Buddhist canon, he would say that, most people who would come to him would achieve enlightenment within, a couple of weeks to a month. And I personally found that when working with other Zen students and being around them, that most people achieve enlightenment within about that time. There are those that don't. And that's because they have deep-seated convictions, doubts, that they just hold on to. They won't let go. And this is something that, a lot of times, you can run into people who would just sort of sit in a Zen center for years on end and just flat out will tell you enlightenment does not exist. And that's because they are totally stuck. I've even met Zen teachers who did not achieve enlightenment and would tell you that it doesn't exist, and would say that, oh no, Zen is just a religion that we pray to this Buddha guy over here and follow moralistic rules and codes, and that's what we do. And that's kind of a sad view of Zen, because you realize that the teacher never achieved enlightenment. They didn't understand what Zen was. However, they were just around long enough within the Zen Center organization and were granted the rank of Zen teacher, and that happens. It's just like in Zen they have this thing called the lineage transmission, and it was explained to the congregation by a particular Zen abbot that transmission of the lineage, which means the authorization to teach, does not mean that the person's enlightenment or have attained anything. It just is sometimes it's done as encouragement, sometimes it's done to help them along the path. So this is something that a lot of the Zen students, when they see, well, this person's the teacher, obviously they're enlightened, right? That is not necessarily the case at all. And sometimes the case is that the teacher is just somebody that was put into that position by the much larger organization because they didn't know what to do with that person. And then there's also the view of, well, surely the organization would not put a person as my teacher who doesn't know anything, or who actually is anti-Buddhist and anti-Zen. Well, yes, sometimes they do. And this is hard for sometimes the Zen students to understand, especially when they start to realize that the teacher that they have been with is not somebody that is good for them. And that happens. I have met a number of students who have said, wow, you're saying things that I've never heard. And it's like, well, yeah, there's reason for that. That's because there's a good chance that your teacher does not believe in any of this, that they have never achieved enlightenment, that they have no faith in the path of Zen, and so they look at Zen as just a praying to the awakened mind, a devotion to the awakened mind, but they really don't know the method of Zen, and they don't really understand the process that you have to go through, because they have never went through it themselves. Either they stopped doing it, or they've somehow in their own mind do not do this. And so this is why when I say the things that I say can be controversial or even shocking, especially to those that have studied Zen or who have went to Zen centers, is because of this reason. And so if you're listening to this and you're saying, well, man, you're really wrong, you don't understand Zen, you don't get it, you're delusional, I would challenge that that you have been given bad information, and you might want to rethink your situation of what you've been taught, because it's possible that those that have taught you these things don't understand what they're teaching either. A lot of us have had experiences in the Christian churches, and we know that by that experience that there's a lot of doubt and skepticism. That I have even run, how many of us have not met a minister or a Catholic priest or your pastor who has told you that they don't believe in God, or they don't believe that Jesus existed. They just don't. And I have certainly met a few that would, they would do the sermons and they would do everything, but when you start to talk to them, they would just flat out tell you that they don't believe God exists, and they don't believe that there's any heaven. So this happens, and it happens in Zen quite a lot. It's a fantasy. It's just completely ludicrous to believe that just because somebody is the teacher at a Zen center, that they're enlightened, that they know what the Zen process is, or they even really know what Zen is. So this is could be a big wake-up call, a big shock, a big kick in the head. All right, so we've kind of talked a lot about what is Zen. And, I guess I would talk about what is not Zen. Well, it's kind of hard to say that, because what is not Zen? Is rule following and following a moralistic code? What is that? And, I can say, well, if it makes you a better person to be around, if these things help you achieve enlightenment, and then I guess they're a good thing. These things in themselves is not enlightenment. And that's basically all I can say about that. So there's nothing in particular in Zen that is enlightenment. And there's nothing in particular in the Zen methodology that you can say that is Zen. But the entire methodology and what it points to, what it is attempting to tell you and encourage you to do, that is Zen. And this is one of these things where it's like, again, we're talking about something that cannot be seen and held or paint a picture of or photographed, but it is a methodology nevertheless. All right, so we've talked a lot about what is Zen and what is enlightenment. In future broadcasts, we'll talk about what happens next. What happens to those that wake up? What is the next steps? So hopefully you'll return and listen to the future podcast of this, and we will continue on in our exploration of the path of Zen.